We're officially starting now. Welcome. Let me start by making some explanations. Alexander Galloway from NYU will not be joining us. We've actually known that for a while. I don't know why it's on the, he just couldn't make it on this date. But in a way, Dana's not here either, but she wanted to be here. She had a very serious personal conflict, but she is here in spirit, and we organized this very much together. So when I'm speaking in this introduction, it's really on behalf of Dana and myself. I should also say that this session, Avatars of the Urban New Metro Media, is a bit of a test run for a project I've been working on with Dana and Roger Sherman that we're just getting going, which will probably be maybe a series of symposia or workshops or projects called Op City that we're working on between University of Toronto and the City Lab at UCLA, which Dana and Roger direct. So let me go to today's subject. This panel was convened to address the widening gulf between the ever-proliferating techniques for describing and analyzing the contemporary city and the real, or perhaps perceived, failures of these analyses to engender design-based modes of urban transformation. It is our conviction, again, Dana and myself, that it is time to evaluate these new methods of seeing, culling data from, mapping and networking the city, both in terms of their utility in projecting the urban present and future, and in terms of their capacity to compel new and existing publics and thereby create the political agency necessary to help realize the cities that these publics desire or imagine. So to restate the problem and the questions we are posing slightly differently, we know that a number of new tools and technologies have emerged for engaging citizens in the processes of reading, engaging with, and imagining both the present and the future of their cities. So given this, one, how do these new avatars of the urban or metro media create the potential for new, more responsive and democratically conceived modes of planning and design? Two, how do these avatars of the urban or metro media create new possibilities for acting locally within or instantiating new forms of community and social life? And three, accepting that these new avatars or metro media are indications that we have moved beyond distinctions between, how shall I put it, physical space and digital space. That is, if concepts such as actually now quite old concepts, but concepts that were held very dear by, let's say, the discourse in urban design, concepts such as genus loci, or more recent concepts such as cyberspace, are now inadequate metaphors to describe the mediums through which cities are produced and reproduced. How might we begin to characterize the conditions or the space that this new work is trying to capture, provoke, or produce? So we have, I think, a stellar triad of panelists who are leading in this realm, and it is particularly important that these are individuals who are pursuing both scholarship on representing the city, especially as a central problem in the history of modernity, and actively developing new concepts and tools for navigating and construing the city that we inhabit today. So they're doing both, and this is a criterion that Dana and I had for selecting the panelists. In fact, their combined ability to theorize the problem and create new tools to address it. So with that, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists before they speak, just so there aren't too many words. We're going to start with Jesse Shapins. Jesse is a media theorist, a documentary artist, and a social entrepreneur whose work has been featured in the New York Times, Metropolis, Praxis, Wired, and cited in books such as The Sentient City and Network Locality, and has been exhibited at MoMA, Deutsche Architektur Zentrum, and the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts, among other venues. He is the co-creator of Dziga, a 2011 Night News Challenge winner that is an open source HTML5 platform for creating interactive documentaries and inventing new forms of storytelling. He also created Yellow Arrow, a seminal project in locative media that involves cities, stickers, mobile phones, and participants in over 450 cities in 39 countries. The Yellow Arrow project transformed the urban landscape into a deep map that expresses the personal histories and hidden secrets that live within our everyday spaces. He also did other projects. He's not going to describe all these. Mapping Main Street, StatBlind, and more recently, the Union Docs Collaborative, a laboratory for documentary research and production in Williamsburg. He's on the faculty now at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he has invented courses such as the Mixed Reality City and Media Archaeology of Place, and is the co-creator, co-founder, associate director of MetaLab at Harvard, a research center at the GSD and the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, which is dedicated to exploring the frontiers and overlooked histories of networked culture. So with that, Jesse.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for that great introduction and inviting me to participate in this, what should be a fantastic discussion. It was in part, I have to admit, I accepted the invitation because of getting to sit together with Eric and Laura and yourself. So what I wanted to do today is just give a little bit of some thoughts, very kind of cursory thoughts on a theoretical position related media and the public and the arts, and then share a series of experiments of practice. It seemed like sort of focusing on actually some of the work and some of the tools in particular would be most interesting for this context. So to start, let's start with the word public. When we hear the word public, I would say it typically connotes some abstract form of community or form of government. But I would like to suggest a slightly different definition, inspired by the thought of French philosopher Bruno Latour. Latour has described the challenges of contemporary society as, quote-unquote, a crisis of representation, but representation in two forms. First, representational legitimacy, that is our loss of faith in our elected officials, but it is the second dimension of Latour's conception is what I find particularly interesting. For him, representation is also the representation of society to the eyes and ears of the people. The public and politics, then, is not only concerned with traditional issues, but is inherently entwined with all forms of cultural activity. So then another word, media. Before the invention of media, or the newspaper, media was singular, medium, understood to be an intervening substance through which a force acts or an effect is produced. And today, I would say media determine our situation, as German critic Friedrich Kittler has argued. But media are not only means of communication. They are extensions, I'd say, of our social and psychological sensory apparatus. In effect, they constitute then, in part, the public domain. So lastly, this question of the arts. What do the arts have to do with this? Understood traditionally, actually, in many senses, nothing at all. The Enlightenment conception of aesthetics dissociated the arts from the public sphere. The classic conception of the artist is romantic, staring off into the wilderness. Arts mean individual emotional expression. But I would say, for me and I presume others in this room, the aesthetic serves actually as a unique category of inquiry and knowledge that can enable different perspectives on society. And for me, particularly, this definition of art is inspired by Soviet avant-garde critic Viktor Shklovsky. In 1918, in an essay entitled Art as Technique, he writes, "Art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged." So I would argue that public media generally, or like news and journalism, foregrounds information first and foremost. And what art does then in this context is foreground experience and focuses then on taking information and transforming that in the context of perception. So let's put this together into a little diagram. So if representation creates the public, and media are the forces through which representation is produced, and art is a technique by which the familiar is made strange, I would then argue that public media arts are the means by which the public is defamiliarized from itself. Arts are necessary in this sense to intervene and disturb the public domain, to reawaken ourselves to each other and to our environment. And so more specifically to this context of the city, then I would say that the hypothesis is that at the core of the city is perception. A city is more than just buildings. What we think about a city and how we perceive it informs the ways that we act within it. And from such a perspective, then, art and media become crucial tools in shaping an urban experience. So that's that little kind of theoretical framing. Onto the projects. the project is not a political debate, but one of the projects that I'd like to talk about is one that started in the context of the 2008 election. It was at a time when we heard a lot of debate about the words Main Street versus Wall Street. And in particular, in 2008, working with a radio producer and an economist, we were listening to Hillary Clinton in speaking and hearing her talk about Main Street and realizing that what she was describing and what many politicians using this term are describing is actually a very sort of singular abstract notion of a people in place. It's evoking sort of this small, crumbling town in the Midwest. You all probably have this image, and this is what politicians are going for when they say this word. In terms of a people, it's probably kind of a later middle-aged male, white, maybe recently unemployed. And what started to occur to us was that this was incredibly frustrating, incredibly limiting in terms of the image of an average American experience, and wildly misrepresented the diversity of both the people and places of the country. And so we created this project, Mapping Main Street, which I'll play a little video here to introduce.
Here on Main Street in City Metro Diner. We're in Lexington, Virginia.
Lucy, Montana.
That was so. You live in Arizona on Main Street.
When you think about living on Main Street, you think of all the
Little shops.
4th of July parades.
Ice cream vendor on the corner.
You picture in your mind a place.
Our particular Main Street connects United States and Mexico.
It's a bunch of hoes and drug dealers. That's all I know about Main Street.
Good place to start a business.
It's a true small town community spirit.
Ain't much, you can as far as it goes right there.
So this project was in part inspired by documentary artists such as Walker Evans and Robert Frank that traveled around the country in the 30s and 50s recording experiences around the nation. And so to start the project, we went on a 14,000-mile road trip all across the country, taking photographs of streets like these streets, single-family homes we saw, some boarded up. Some main streets didn't even have any buildings. These were some of the most remarkable in my mind, these fields like Dayton, Washington. This is Mobile, Alabama. This is Navasota, Texas. But also looking at things like colors and patterns, not just the buildings, looking at the people, not just the human faces, but also these hidden faces, but of course also the people themselves on these streets in different parts of the country. And so the structure of the project consisted of this road trip and the photographs that it entailed, but also a broadcast radio series on NPR. And the first story, and these were sort of longer form, in-depth investigative documentary pieces. And so the first story that we aired was actually about Main Street in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I wanted to just play a little snippet of this piece, which, as you can see, starts with this notion that Main Street is a prostitution strip. So this is a short segment from what was a 12-minute piece, and this is Tammy Waddell speaking, somebody that has lived and worked on Main Street for many years.
I've never had a job down here. Only job I've ever knew was walking. Okay, yeah, you take a left and this is Main Street. I live in Alabama. That's where I'm from. I didn't know what prostituting was or what crack was until I moved to Chattanooga. This is where the girl starts walking. The worst part. There's one right there. I was really embarrassed about myself for doing it. There's another one. I know her. I'd smoke crack just to deal with what I did, but just to get my mind off of it. Yeah, I pretty much got out of these because the last one I was in, he took me in the woods and grabbed me by my hair and head. He didn't pay me. I just cried. I stopped that night. I was going to die. And then he just like made me get in the van and got me off like it wasn't nothing. And the worst bad he had his 13-year-old child was in the back seat asleep. I didn't know the child was back there until I got in the car. And that.
So I wanted to put these up here, and I brought this in. I usually don't actually speak about this as much, but I think for this context it's quite interesting. So this is the debate that then formed on NPR's website following this story. And I think what was remarkable was you had this sort of outrage that some people in Chattanooga felt that the name Main Street was being used to describe their town. And in particular, people would talk about how this was not the real Main Street. There were other real Main Streets. There was the downtown. This was not Main Street. And I think what this points to, and can use as a sort of context for a broader kind of conversation later, is I think that one of the opportunities or one of the challenges in this type of practice is thinking about topics that are frames that make sense and provoke discussion. And I think that's really in many ways the hardest thing. And I think one of the things that was so powerful about this Main Street project is there's so many associations that are built up, and the prospect of using actually data and an alternative approach to storytelling is a means by which to undermine those. So the way that the project worked online is there's a website, and anybody could contribute photos and video to Flickr, and it would automatically appear on the site. So this is actually looking at somebody from Grand Junction, Colorado, found these historical images in their local library and walked out on the street. And you're able to browse also by different routes, such as the state of Colorado, and different themes. And what's been amazing about this is that it's something that we haven't touched this for about 3.5 years, and people continue to contribute. This is a recent photograph actually here from Cambridge. And that's one of the things I actually most enjoy about these projects, is you just don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what types of unexpected things people will do using these systems. And this is I found one of the most remarkable, actually, stories that emerged from this, is a man named Jim Hare. These are his photographs. He moved from Berkeley, California to Richmond, Indiana, and started taking photographs of people on Main Street. And he got to know so many people that he actually ran for mayor.
Hello, I'm Jim Hare, and I am running for mayor of Richmond, Indiana.
Unfortunately, did not win. But this is, and then sort of the big topic in a sense then for me is around this notion of designing context for participation. So it's not that technology itself is going to do anything. It's not that the technology, we have so many more tools available, but we've always had tools. I think the real challenge is how do you design a meaningful context in which people use these tools and connect those to other people and then connect those to their local communities. So very quickly, we were going to do 10, but there's one person missing, so I think we'll take 15 apiece. I wanted to introduce where this project has led, which is to Dziga, which is an open source platform that is currently in development, developing a series of experimental projects, one of which is in partnership with Laura. And the main goal, really, for Dziga is to try to make this sort of making of the web itself, the ability to take the tools to create a project like Mapping Main Street. This project took, in effect, $150,000 and a large team to pull off. The prospect of making it possible to do projects like this without having to have extensive technology and design teams. So some of the early stage experiments for this have been done actually in teaching environments. This is a course that I taught 1.5 years ago at Harvard called Media Archaeology of Place. And a student who had no programming experience at all and didn't write any code created a project about Revere Beach, which some of you might know is sort of the Coney Island of the Boston metro area, where she takes you on a journey on a train out to Wonderland. This is her iPhone recording, overlaid with sound, historical images that she found then at the Historical Society. And this project, in part, is also another, I know this context, this event here is also about education. And I think what was really fascinating here was giving a student an opportunity to go and do something using these tools in the context of the real world. And she was invited back by all the people of this Historical Society to present this project and then featured on the local news station in the ways that it sort of reframed and brought to life the history of the place. Some other ways in which the project and Dziga's tools have been used is challenging perceptions of public spaces. So the other course I've taught is called the Mixed Reality City. And this is more focused on combining media and physical places. And this is a project called Invisible Cities, where students created this map of imaginary cities at Government Center. And so this is imagining experiencing this on your iPhone or your iPad. Very simple, using text and images to reframe the perception of a place that, despite some architects, most people really don't like, that I personally really liked, and these students also particularly love, and had the idea of what would it look like if you start to reframe these classic locations with what would be like if they were islands. So I think a kind of unique example of how simple kind of aesthetic strategies can really change the way that people look at everyday environments. And so there's a few other examples, but I kind of want to wrap up and jump here to just the end, which is just a brief note on where this name comes from, and I think it's maybe a potentially useful transition to Laura, which is an avant-garde artist named Dziga Vertov. So he was somebody that worked in the context of the Soviet Union, and he was one of the first people to be thinking about the moving image in the context of broadcast media. He created Kino Pravda, which was taking the Pravda newspaper and turning it into a film. And this was a time, much like our own, where there was all these new media recording technologies proliferating, but there was also a real culture of experimentation. So here you see wheeling a projector out on a horse and buggy into a town square, and then throwing up a sheet as a means of projecting news and finding new ways for information to be projected and encountered in the community. And I think it's that kind of culture of experimentation and actually looking also to history and not getting particularly caught up in just what a new tool can do, but thinking about how people use tools that most inspires this work. So, thank you.
Okay, we're going to move next to Laura Kurgan. Laura is an associate professor of architecture at the Graduate School of Architecture, Preservation, and Planning at Columbia University, where she's the director of the Spatial Information Design Lab, that's SIDL, and the director of Visual Studies. Her work explores things ranging from digital mapping technologies to the ethics and politics of mapping, new structures of participation in design, and the visualization of urban and global data. Her recent research includes a multi-year SIDL project on, quote, $1 million blocks, unquote, that I'm sure many of you have seen pieces of, I think in the New York Times, and the urban costs of the American incarceration experiment, as it were, and a collaborative exhibition on global migration and climate change. Her work has appeared in the Cartier Foundation in Paris, the Venice Architectural Biennale, the Whitney Altria, MACBA Barcelona, ZKM in Karlsruhe, and the Museum of Modern Art, where it is part of the permanent collection. She was the winner of the United States Artist Rockefeller Fellowship in 2009 and named one of Esquire magazine's best and brightest in 2008. She has published articles and essays in Assemblage, Grey Room, Any, Volume, Elsewhere, Mapping, and other books and journals. So please welcome Laura Kurgan.
Okay. So I'm going to do a bit of an experiment today because I am presuming a lot of you know the $1 Million Blocks project and the migration project, and we've been working in the lab on a grant which was from the Rockefeller Foundation, who did an experimental initiative on smart cities and commissioned us in a way to write a paper on data visualization and how it's had a positive or negative effect on cities through history. So I've just finished this paper. It's too long for this context, but what I'm going to do is try and link to some of the things that Jesse has said, and just so stop me. I can 5
I'm going to make
minutes
some sort of.
Yeah, no, it's really and it's really fine because the parts are very discrete, and so it's not as if it's it'll be out of the blue. Okay, and so the paper is called Making Data Public, and I'm not going to go over the Latour parts because Jesse did those very well. But so just to introduce it, okay, we live in a world that is prodigiously productive of information, everything from routine taxi trips to the advanced scientific labs, which seem to generate information, usually in the form of statistical data and at exponentially increasing rates. But what do we do with it? How do we turn all that data into knowledge that we can think with? These are crucial questions for everyday life, for government policy, and today, more than ever, for structuring questions and practices known as data visualization, which our lab has somehow come to be known to represent in terms of a storytelling variety of data visualization. The guiding assumptions of this field are summed up in the idea that it's important for both the producers and consumers of data to have it available in a language or form that can be interpreted, evaluated, and distributed, and second, that that language or form is a visual one. This presupposition, which is in fact not just one assumption, but a nested series of givens, needs to be critically examined, not because it is false, but because it's untested and unargued. Challenging it can open up new horizons, both for technical and political and new ways of working with data, and it also can make the work that we do with data and images richer, smarter, more relevant, and more responsive to the needs and interests of all citizens, especially those on the margins. So we're trying to argue here that this critical approach is especially important in thinking about urban space and policy and in fostering new avenues for substantive public participation in urban planning and analysis. Digital archives on the one hand and newly generated data collected from devices embedded in everyday items such as clothing, phones, vehicles, roads, buildings, and appliances on the one hand, and on the other constitute immense resources for thinking and decision making. But only a critical approach to them will allow us to demand access to and then to deploy these newly available resources in a way that will fundamentally change the way we learn about, finance, design, see, and move about our cities. So just to confirm that in a sense to be critical is not to act from a critical distance and to evaluate that other people use data in negative terms, but on the contrary, it's important to act with data in an alert, questioning, skeptical, critical, and even self-critical way. And that's really, it's an element of all the work that I do. It's not talking about things, it's talking with the visualization strategies that we're doing. So just, a few images from the lab. This diagram, you really can enter into at any point and firmly believe that any form of design is somehow a feedback loop, which includes data, people, policy, the built environment, and a very specific kind of design, which is an inclusive and multidisciplinary. So this is the $1 Million Blocks project, which really moved from a collaboration with a criminal justice activist and was really the first project of the Spatial Information Design Lab, which instead of mapping crime in the city, maps the home address of incarcerated people and shows that, money is basically millions and millions of dollars are sent out of very poor neighborhoods of most cities in New York to generally to upstate. So this is a picture over here, a map of Brownsville, which shows you how much money is spent on every particular person. So we've taken this project through scenario planning workshops. We've been inspired by the Yellow Arrow project to work with a group of kids in Brownsville and try to get them to map assets rather than crime in Brownsville. It turned out that they had such an active Facebook page that actually they really didn't need to do that. And then this is a project that Sarah Williams has done, which is she's the co-director of the lab, and it's about mapping Foursquare check-ins. And then finding out that, although everybody's trying to become a mayor of a specific main street or main restaurant, what they actually check in with is a very psychological language about the city. And so that's often what we're looking for in the lab. It's sort of an inadvertent use of data, and instead of just being very technocratic about, statistics and things like that, we actually think that there's a very creative moment in the use of data, and that's what really that inadvertent part of the use of data is. It's always using it for reasons that it was not made for. So then this is a project Terra Natal. It was another big collaboration of a multi-year project, but what I'm focusing on over here is the way it's going to continue as a collaboration with Jesse and his team. And it's the part of the project which is about remittances, which are the very small amounts of money that migrants send home to their home country. And when this money was actually counted up, it turned out that 150 million migrants are sending very small amounts of money, averaging $200 a year. And it turns out to actually be 3 times more than the foreign aid that's sent to developing countries. So this is a global phenomenon, but really it's played out at a local level. And although we've done this incredible mapping at the global level, what I've always wanted to do is tell the story at the local level. And so we're working with Jesse and Dziga to come up with a way of introducing a more analytic mapping strategy as part of the storytelling, and how to tell storytelling through maps. And this is a workshop actually that I ran in Barcelona, where we were evaluating this part of the city called the Raval. And what you find in places where migrants are living are not banks but remittance locations, so places like Western Union, but they often are much more hybrid spaces, supermarkets with nostalgic food from various countries, or hairdressing where a particular kind of hairstyle, or restaurant or bread or things like that. So this is in Barcelona, where we found all these places. This is Roosevelt Avenue in Queens. We're actually working through Dziga and their team with some journalists who are going to LA to study this part of LA, which is called Caraxico, where there's a specific restaurant where there's a relationship with a tiny little village just outside of Oaxaca, where 90 people from that village then live within a 5-block radius of LA. And so we're starting to map these stories. So far we have, Latin America, we have a lot of stories from Africa, we have some stories from Asia, etc. Okay, and this is Tuba, which is a migrant population that is actually located many places in the world. It's kind of the opposite of globalization, because they're sending money back to a religious city outside of Senegal, but they're mostly street traders and restaurant owners in many parts of the world, so the city is really developed through remittances, through the sale of fake Prada bags and Senegalese food and things like that. So in another context, I would explain mapping Main Street, but I don't have to. Okay, so that's just a snapshot of the projects that are going on in the lab. So the paper then goes on to ask, what is data visualization? And it's really a word that only emerged in the 90s. Michael Friendly and Daniel Dennis have charted in a website. It's called the History. It's a history of data visualization, milestones in the history of thematic cartography, statistical graphics, and data visualization. They argue that while the graphic portrayal of quantitative information has deep roots stretching from cave paintings all the way to information visualization, the visual representation of large-scale collections of non-numerical information, such as files and lines of code in software systems, library and bibliographic databases, networks of relations on the internet, and so forth, data visualization proper is a relatively recent phenomenon. They call it a science of visual representation of data, defined as information which has been abstracted in some schematic form, including attributes or variables for units of information. This topic could be taken to subsume the 2 major foci, statistical graphics and thematic cartography, which is really, again, what we do in the lab. It's a storytelling with mapping. So thanks to this definition, the range of visualizations they examine include both graphical and geographical modes of interpreting statistics. Charts, pie charts, histograms, bar charts, line graphs were all invented, according to Friendly and Dennis, in the 1850s, and in some sense, form the infrastructure of most of the statistical graphic visualizations we see today. So they're claiming that there's very little new in this field, right? So data visualization appeared in the mainstream media when in February 2010, The Economist devoted a large portion of the magazine section called Show Me, a special report on managing information which elaborated on new ways of visualizing data. It collected a range of articles in order to demonstrate that this project of displaying very large amounts of data in accessible ways was a vibrant and creative field melding the skills of computer science, statistics, artistic design, and storytelling, which is very much, again, in keeping with the way that Jesse is defining this whole field. I don't know what Eric's going to say next, but hopefully it'll have the same, thing. So the combination in these two words of the title, Show Me, of a plea and a demand, says everything about the contemporary need for data visualization. The report goes on to say that every field has some central tension it is trying to resolve. Visualization with an inhuman scale of information and the need to present it in the very human scale of what the eye can see. But this emphasis on visual leads the economist writer to wonder, is it art or is it information? Embedded in the question is a worry or even a distrust of pictures, especially pretty ones. Are they reliable vehicles for that precious information? The distrust goes even further sometimes to say that pictures get in the way of objective science or the seriousness of numbers or statistics. In the first example, in Show Me, is the now canonical and maybe trusted data visualization and translation of numbers for instant comprehension created in 1998 by Martin Wattenberg. It is a map of the market and presents data as a tree map. A designed map of the market while at smartmoney.com. The goal was to give a quick answer to the question, what's happening in the market? The map quickly became to be one of the most trafficked sections of the site and spawned many imitators. Today, tree maps are the standard tool for visualizing financial data.
No, you're okay. I'm sorry. I just leaned in.
No, I'm doing okay on time? Okay. Five more minutes. Okay, so so there's many sites which are trying to encourage any users to be able to do automatic data visualizations. This is Gapminder, where this is about world hunger, for instance. But most importantly, Tufte has now been appointed by President Obama to visually display the stimulus money, right? So data visualization then is a rapidly emerging field driven by the urgency of the apparent need to make sense of data produced daily by our computer and communication networks, by business and governments, and privately in a host of daily life transactions. These images have become increasingly familiar in our daily measuring and reading of the world around us. But how legible are they? Are they art? Are they science? And are they too optimistic in their attempt to convert data into knowledge? More importantly, what are they communicating? What is the ideology embedded in the data and its presentation? Right. So, when Tufte was named by President Obama to the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board for the specific purpose, which was to visualize statistics about the stimulus and to make it transparent to a national audience potentially interested in how public money is being spent, Tufte told the Newsweek blogger, this is about visual thinking and visual evidence. It's not about commercial art. The last thing in the world that's needed here is a designer. What a lie that is. What's needed is an analytical, statistical, quantitative approach. Reporting is different from pitching. Artists who design for marketing purposes inherently have problems with credibility. This is something very different in spirit. It's about accountability and transparency with heavy amounts of data. Built into Tufte's statement is in fact an ideology, which is not just his, but one that has been remarkably consistent as the field of data visualization has developed. He says he's decided to take on the job because he wanted to present visual evidence to the American public with math, statistics, quantitative analysis, and facts, which is to say without opinion, interest, or prior agenda pitching. The numbers should speak for themselves as long as they are clearly presented in the name of transparency and accountability. He will let the data tell the truth, right? So where we go next in this paper is really trying to understand how this has played out in history, and really when you do a Google search under data visualization, you get all these incredibly complex images. But what we're trying to claim is that actually data visualization is at the heart of modernization and urbanism, right? So can I have 5 more minutes and then I'll be done?
What do you think? Yes.
Yeah, okay. So nowhere is the ideology embedded in the use of data visualization and the need for a critical approach to it more evident than its use in urban planning, urban policy, and the built environment. The last several years have seen in particular an upsurge in the interest among private and public agencies in the use of data and data visualization for design, planning, and management of urban environments. IBM has trademarked the term the smarter city to describe in its recent work in this area, while Cisco calls it intelligent urbanization. These terms have come to define city management strategies that rely on big data, the exponentially increasing data collected, but almost everything in our world will often automatically or via the so-called Internet of Things. Cities which are run on information will transform the quality of life for citizens, drive economic growth, and improve city services and management, says Cisco's chief of globalization. So the notion of a city populated by network devices which simultaneously collect data about themselves and their surroundings and report that data for analysis in near real time is decidedly new, but underlying the idea that such data, once made available in a form that is inaccessible and understandable to city managers and citizens, will allow us to see hitherto unseen urban phenomena about their patterns in the way that will allow them to be harnessed or transformed, is practically synonymous, and this is the most important point, with modern urban planning itself. Embedded in these projects is not simply the optimism of the ideology of data visualization, but the very strategy of urban planning as we know it from the 20th century. A city that is run on information is a modern city, and the capacity of that information visualization to show us what's there but otherwise unseen, and with this new clarity to let us solve urban problems efficiently, is what the city planner most fervently hopes for. So, and that's how it goes on. The optimistic hope for this efficient city management is really, the same as the efficient city from Robert Moses and Harlan Bartholomew, who actually created the techniques of, survey mapping. This is from Chicago in the 1930s, where they're, mapping social delinquents, and this is the drawings that were made prior to the demolition of huge swaths of the East Village. The very controversial redlining maps. On and on. So we're really trying to consider the city as a field of data and look at all the new ways that it's being used. This is one of the most famous examples right now of the German politician who demanded his cell phone data just in order to teach people what cell phone companies are doing with their data. So really, to conclude, we're trying to say that data visualization is a new phrase and a hot topic, but it's not a new idea. In a certain sense, it's synonymous with modern urban planning itself. Cities have long been seen as fields of data, and data has built and unbuilt and rebuilt the planet cities large and small. It is the quantity and availability of that data, though, that is new. Data is becoming democratized both in terms of the production and its consumption. It is clear that we do things with data, and so the understanding of the ways in which we gain access to it has become critically important. Democratizing access is the first step in putting data in the hands of people who need it, but it is not enough. Access to data alone can teach you how to use it ethically and responsibly. Those who access data also need to know how to use it. And we have seen how misuse and appropriation of data can have dramatic effects on the lives and shapes of our cities, many of which have seen large parts redeveloped or removed by data-driven processes of urban renewal. This could easily happen again if we don't look at the biases in analysis, whether they come from top-down or bottom-up, crowdsourced or from the planners. So in order to think critically about data visualizations we consume and create, we must challenge the ideology of data neutrality and explore who has assembled what data, how, and why.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. That
Thank you, Laura.
was okay.
Okay, finally,
Yeah.
back to my notes here.
Oh, that wasn't bad. That was 17 minutes.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's excellent. Okay. Eric Gordon. Eric Gordon's work focuses on location-based media, media and urbanism, and games for civic engagement. He's an associate professor in the Department of Visual and Media Arts at Emerson College, and he is the director of the Engagement Lab. His book, The Urban Spectator, American Concept Cities, From Kodak to Google, is about the intersections of media and American urbanism. He's also the co-author of a book about location-aware media called Net Locality, Why Location Matters in a Networked World. And in 2007, he co-founded Hub2, the Hub2 project, which explores how virtual environments can engage people in community planning by enabling meaningful and sustainable deliberation. He was awarded a MacArthur Digital Media and Learning Grant to continue with this work. The result is the game Participatory Chinatown that launched in May 2010. His latest game project is called Community Planet, or communityplanet.org? At communityplanet.org.
Yeah.
Okay, please welcome Eric Gordon.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll be very quick, just so we can get to the conversation, because I think that would be the most meaningful part of this session. And I want to start with something you said, and wholeheartedly agree with what you said, and talk about this idea of the ideology of information that you brought up. And that's exactly where I feel like my work stems from, which is contending with the ideology of information and trying to figure out ways in which people can, building context for people to actually use that information. So it's going from transactions to communication in a way. And I think games can be a powerful way to do that. And that's really what I want to talk about today is some of the game projects that I've done. And just go immediately into sort of the context in which I feel games can be useful. I also feel like games also take off from what's already been said in the sense of the distrust of pretty pictures that you mentioned. There's also a distrust of anything that might be fun, and I think it's a really interesting cultural problem. And in the projects that I've done in working with community organizations or with large organizations or cities, the issue has always been, well, if it's fun, people aren't going to take it seriously. And if it's fun, it must be frivolous. And I think that's a really fascinating problem because ultimately the work of participation, the work of democracy, the work of civic engagement is actually then tied to hard work. And it doesn't always have to be that way. So let me say a little bit about where I'm heading with this. So I'm going to talk about two projects, and I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. Oops. The Participatory Chinatown project that was mentioned, and Community Planet, which is the platform. And similar to Jesse's trajectory, the first project was a very kind of heavily built single project in a single location, and the second project was my desire to platformize that heavily built project. And I think that's a lot of our trajectories, and the idea that if we get something to sort of work in a place, how do we expand that? How do we make it cheap and readily available? So I'm talking about the context of public meetings, as I said, I'm interested in where people come together to actually talk about these things. So where information is made available to the public, and that became the context for my game design. And so just a little bit about public meetings and perceptions of them. It's interesting. So nearly all U.S. municipal officials value public engagement. 81% agreed processes typically attracted same residents who complained or promoted favorite issues. And 68% agreed that cities would make more engagement efforts and be more effective if citizens participated more constructively, which is an interesting paradox, perhaps. So likewise, residents doubt impacts of their own participation. And this is one of my favorite lines ever from anything. Forget my question, never mind, I wouldn't believe the answer anyway. And I feel like this is, this is the context that we're working in. That essentially when the public engage with whatever information is being presented to them, the level of distrust in most cases with this realm of the public, and I like the way that Jesse defined that. I think that's an interesting point of intervention in this as well, and perhaps a way of contending with the issues of trust and mistrust. So the issue for me was how do you then take that context where people actually contend and deliberate about this information, and how do you augment that through other forms? And again, in my case, I'm going to specifically talk about games. So here's a bit about participatory Chinatown, and I want to say why a game might matter in this case. Games simplify. That's actually an important thing. Games provide sort of false barriers to participation in the sense that they have rules, and players have to agree to participate in those rules, agree to follow those rules in order to make it meaningful. And that's an important part of the experience of being in a game. And then they tell a story. And part of that story is that, and it's an immersive kind of storytelling in most cases, in that when people experience that story, they enter into what game theorists call a magic circle. So you enter into this space, and essentially within that magic circle, you agree to the rules, you agree to the story, you suspend your disbelief. Even when we're playing a game of Monopoly, we all have to agree to the rules to a certain extent in order to make that work, and that's the magic circle. And I want to get back to that in a little bit. So let me tell you about the project we did in Chinatown, just a bit about Boston's Chinatown. It's a 46-acre neighborhood in Boston. It was updating its master plan, as it does every 10 years. And it's an interesting context, as most Chinatowns are. Gentrifying, it has a unique identity that its residents are invested in protecting, and it's ethnically and socioeconomically diverse. I'll just say that for now. What we wanted to do is to essentially build a land is start off with that. So take that space of the town hall meeting and figure out ways in which we can build a game around that space. So using networks to connect outside of that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But it was a challenge. We needed to develop a multilingual networked game, essentially to reframe this master planning process. So a bit about the game. Actually, let me go ahead and play a little video, just to give you some introduction to this.
Physical space. Okay, so what we do is we go and explore and try to find these cards. So I've already gotten a few of them. And you read all the things that your character has, and then you try to find cards or spaces. So this person is interested in finding good restaurants and clothes and stuff in their apartment and meeting people. So we're trying to find places that can do that.
We see so many people turning to games. The White House is turning to games. You see different calls for educational games that can help. And I think people are starting to realize that games get people out talking to each other. They form discourse communities with each other. They're talking and they're creating things that you don't get with a lot of other mediums.
He just found his house in real in this community game. Yeah, and I think obviously he recognized the streets and the building he lives in.
We got involved with this project because we really want to find.
Okay, I'm gonna leave that there, just in the interest of time. So you have a little bit of a sense of the game, and let me just describe. So what you do in the game is you select a character and a quest. So there were 15 characters. Each player selected a character that had a bio, and that each character was on a quest. They were either looking for a house, they were either looking for a place to live, a place to work, or a place to socialize. They had to discover local opportunities by walking around the Chinatown that is, essentially. And then they had to make the best decision as their character through the options. And they were inhabiting the same virtual space as other people in the room. We actually had 50 people playing at a time. We had 10 people inhabiting the same virtual environment at a single time, and we had 5 parallel universes going on at the same time within that room. And we brought them together in some ways. These are the characters. Again, I won't go into them, but each character had a background, had a story to tell. And each person, when they came in, they wore a name tag they had their own name, and they also had their character's name on their. You saw that in the video, and that was an important part. And when people spoke when they spoke to each other, we actually tried to get them to speak in first person as their character. These are what the cards look like. You went around and you looked for cards, and you put them into your side area there. When you walked into people, they would either help you with your quest by giving you a card, or they would just give you useful information about the city. This person nicely says, "I can't help with your quest, but here's a quick fact. About 38% of Asians in the Chinatown area experience poverty each year. Of those below the poverty line, 13% are children and 23% are seniors." This is exactly what happens in the streets of Chinatown. People say really nice things that are really useful all the time, and so that in that sense it was very believable. So what happened was they picked something for their character, and then in the second part of after they picked something for their character, they were told what they got. So they were told, okay, well, I got the job that I wanted, or I didn't get the job that I wanted because maybe somebody else in the room got it, or maybe I wasn't qualified, or my English skills weren't good enough, or there was a reason for that. And what that was a spark for conversation in the second part. So that's what happened in the second part, where people began to talk about the sort of justice or injustice of the decision, or what happened to their character. There was a debriefing section, which in the literature on games, we know that, in fact, learning in games mostly happens in debriefing about games, not actually in gameplay. So personal decision-making was the second part, or the third part here, where at this part, you ripped off your character bio or your character name, and you became yourself again. And then you were able to rank values in Chinatown as yourself in this case. And you walked around a kind of tabula rasa now of the development area, as opposed to the existing Chinatown that wasn't experiencing development. So you ranked personal values and saw a related walkable 3D scenario in this scenario. And then people discuss the validity of the scenarios as the next part of the game. What we learned in looking at this was we learned that we went into this thinking that there was going to be direct impact in people's decisions, or rather people were going to self-report that they were going to say, well, I came in thinking this and now I think that. That was naive. And that's not what happened. But what did happen is that people said that they understood a lot about their character, and they were thinking differently about the situation while it didn't impact their decisions directly. And the way that we thought about that was that, in fact, what the difficult area here is sort of transgressing the magic circle. So in the case of a game, when you enter into a magic circle and you agree to the rules, what happens when you're done playing a game is that you're done agreeing to those rules. You say, well, I'm finished with this game and now I'm going to do something else. Well, the same is true in this context, where we tried to take a game and bring it into a real-life community context. The same thing happened, where people, they went along with it. They agreed to the rules. They were in the magic circle. And then afterwards, they decided, well, I'm going to make my moral decisions based on my own moral framework and not the framework that I agreed to in the game. But as we know, what gameplay can do is that it can teach you about systems, and it can reframe. And I think the possibilities here are significant in that the sort of systems thinking that people were able to do. So what we did learn in the interviews that we did afterwards, that what people self-reported was that they understood the relationship between things in a way that they didn't understand it prior to the game. So while it didn't directly affect their decisions, it did reframe the decisions, even though it didn't change them. So that's what we learned. Moving forward, and I'll just take 2 more minutes. The project Community Planet is the platform that we're building now. That's not in this case a 3D game, but we're working more towards a web-based, 2-dimensional kind of experience. But it's a platform, and it can be used in various contexts and in various cities or planning efforts. The goal here is to create a mission-based game to engage stakeholders. I should say the pilot test we did was with the Boston Public Schools a couple months ago, where we were engaging the school system we were helping the school system engage the public in community planning, essentially. And what they were engaging parents and teachers and students in was the idea of school quality. So in this case, it's a very different context than the Chinatown game, but that's what we were doing here. And we did a case study that I won't go into. But this game, Community Planet, instead of being a one-time game where you come in for a public meeting and the game takes place there, Community Planet, the idea is that it lasts now for 30 days and then culminates in a face-to-face meeting. So we're trying to now extend what happens online and the kind of data sharing that people do and conversation that we can cultivate online within a mission-based system. So what happens is that there are missions, and the missions can be anywhere from 3 to 5 days, whatever you want it to be, and the missions are themed. So essentially it's sort of a structured, choreographed conversation even that takes place within the public around particular missions, and there's something at stake in completing those missions, and then as players complete those missions, and then they move on to the next mission, and then hopefully show up at the debriefing session at the very end. Here's a simple visualization of that. And let me just end with a little sort of silly video from Community Planet. I'm happy to answer more questions about that if it comes up, but this is just a minute long.
Okay, well, the next item on the agenda is vacant lot number 8934.
Ah, yes, lot 8934, my architectural legacy. Well, don't hold back. Let me hear your ideas for this space.
Well, let's see. How about a high-rise? Now, that's something I wouldn't mind getting in on the ground floor with. I second that. Wouldn't we all? But I think there would be some conflict of interest with that idea, John. Well, what about a museum? Or a park?
No high-rises, no museums, no parks. Good grief, we have plenty of these things in our town. I'll tell you what we need. A state-of-the-art parking lot. Now, that or a landfill.
If only there was a way to involve the community in this process.
The community? That's preposterous. I don't see how that could ever work.
Cindy, you're proposing that everyone take part in the planning process?
Wait, if I'm hearing this correctly, you're suggesting we let the community plan it.
So, and I'll just say that we're rapidly sort of moving to the release of this at the beginning of May, and we're going to be working in the city of Detroit and the city of Boston, and again with the Boston Public Schools in May, and then we're hopefully rolling out into other cities as this becomes open and usable. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
You guys come back up. Well, there's many roads into this discussion. Maybe because I have many roads, I'll go in a little bit of an order of the presentations to begin the discussion. It was interesting, Jess, you started with this reference to Victor Shklovsky and the theories of estrangement. And made a very interesting proposition that for the inhabitants of the city to actually be able to engage the city, it needed to be somehow defamiliarized to them, and that was the role of media and arts and the kind of in a way, the revealing of the city is to initially make it strange so people can actually see what may be hidden before their very eyes. Laura, you took off in a slightly different, in a slightly different direction, talking about the kind of mythology around the objectivity of data, and the way in which the calculation of the city is the very basis of planning, and a lot of both the successes and radical failures of planning have been in the, let's say, reading and misreading and misuse of data, anything from redlining to, demographics. And I definitely want to come back to that and talk about, because there's still, when you talk to many, especially people on the engineering side and on the technology company side, there is still this great kind of cybernetic fantasy that if we can only, there was this guy who wrote the article about 2 years ago, in the New York Times, about, that we just aren't making a calculation of the city well enough. If we only had, could control the data, we could yes, we could actually engineer a better city. And finally, with Eric, I think you addressed more directly the question of how engaging people in the medium. One of the first things you said was you go from translation to communication, translation of the information that's available to the phenomenon of what happens when people are when information and ideas are actually communicated in a social.
I said transaction, but I like translation too.
Okay, transaction. Sorry, transaction. From a transactional to from the art of transaction to the art of communication. There's some things we actually talked about in the pre-conversation here that actually haven't surfaced in the discussion, so I think might be a way of cutting across the three. And one has to do with with how the techniques and the use of data and the use of communication tools that you're all looking at change the scale at which we are able to act in the city. We talked about this phenomenon of this new localization of action that this new software allows. And so I want to try and find a way of getting at the way in which very large-scale phenomena are described here, but also coming down to the scale of of the individual dwelling or the individual place on a street has become much more palpable or possible with this new technology. And then, so that's one question about the scale of representation and engagement with citizens. And the other, to bring us back to design at some point, I think, is this question of the democratization of design, or the democratization of decision making that the tools and the media we're talking about allow. And to do that, I'd like to sort of get at, I think, what are two competing ideas of democracy, at least in the context of the United States. If I can find it in my notes here. And I'm putting these out here for a rhetorical purpose. One is the more Enlightenment version of democracy, the representational, rights-based, collective notions of democracy. The idea we have when we say the right to the city and the right to be represented in the making of the city. I'm just putting this in the city context. The second competing idea of democracy, which is very much, at least in the United States, is much a part of our tradition, and has been rearing its head much more in recent years, is a more libertarian stripe, which has to do with a freedom-based idea of democracy, which has to do with physical, social, and economic mobility. The way in which the city allows people to remake themselves in a very individualistic manner and liberate themselves actually from traditional notions of community. I think what's challenging about many of the tools that you're looking at, particularly if we start where we ended with Eric, is you're trying to actually create a new form of communication and in a way collective understanding, whether it's at a local or a larger scale, which runs up against what some of these technologies now allow, which is a highly disaggregated, highly individualized way of everyone makes their own city through their own Google map, right? in a Dvorevian sense. So let's begin there, and then I'll take some questions from out there. I think that was a question to you.
Oh, was that a direct question to me?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Or Laura might want to go. Whoever wants to jump in on that.
I'd like to add to that question is how do you think you're changing community participation, right? Because architects, I'm sure there's a lot of architects in the room who are very mistrustful of that kind of notion of design because it sometimes gets in the way.
Yes. So I'm very, very familiar with those problems,
Yeah.
Yes. So I'll say that the way that I approach my own work is that there's a difference between feedback and engagement, and what I'm most interested in is the engagement part. But I do believe that better engagement can lead to better feedback, and I also believe that more feedback can be the better economic decision in the end as well. It could actually, the process could go smoother. But let me just say a little bit about that distinction between engagement and feedback. I think what typically happens in planning processes is that there's a need to get feedback from the community, and often that feedback is very structured around, there's a straw man, and we hear you, this is what the community wants, and feed it back to the community. And so, and that process is deeply flawed, and the challenge, and I think the opportunity here, is that these tools and the way in which people are communicating with each other, just generally, but specifically with design tools for this purpose, can allow for people to learn in the context of planning and of design, and that's what gets left out. The idea that we'll go to the community because they already somehow know the answers is wrong. The context should be we go to the community because we need to create a learning environment, both for us and the community, and by creating platforms so that people can learn, meaning sharing information, discoursing about that, and then being able to co-create. So it's not as scary as designing by committee. It's actually about setting up learning environments.
But the issue is how people come to know what they want.
Yeah.
Or in a sense, so we don't suppose that people know. I had someone say to me in the context of work like this, it's not. I don't, as a designer or an urbanist, I don't go to a meeting to find out what they want. I go to find out what they know, and in finding out what they know, I can begin to do my what they know about where they live and what they know about their what I can come to know about their lives and their understanding of the place. I can do a better job in that sense. When you design the tool, and it is kind of a tool, and you talked about asking the people in Chinatown whether they wanted residential or commercial or mixed use, for an architect or for an urban designer, that would be considered a very crude rendition of the complexity that goes into forming a place like that. So that's when I say how you construct the tool to get to an understanding of what people understand or what they know, or even before we get into the question of what they might desire. Or
let me just say one thing, and then I'm going to let somebody else talk. But it is a crude rendition. What's more of a crude rendition is simply to give a PowerPoint presentation and then give people sticky dots to put on a wall.
Well, we can all agree on that.
So that's a more crude rendition. People understand people translate what they know to what they think they want, right?
Right.
So this is what I mean by creating learning environments, that it's a matter of, in the Chinatown game, we didn't let people speak as themselves until they had the opportunity to play as a character. That was the goal. We scaffolded the entire process so that there could be some learning before there was this is what I know moment. And I think that's true with Community Planet too, and it's true with some of the other projects I'm working on. It's about sort of communicating this idea that learning is a process, and then what you know at the beginning of a process isn't what you're going to know at the end. And if you can get people to buy into that idea, then we're going to get away from some of the fears that you're expressing.
Jesse, you want to jump in on this?
Well, I mean, I think the thing I mean, that you raised around this question of these kind of competing notions, in a sense that you're suggesting that the web has, I mean, I think there's an interesting sort of subtext or subcorollary, and that others have also argued that the web sort of almost facilitates that second, more libertarian model.
Perhaps.
Perhaps. I mean, whether that's what you're suggesting or not. I mean,
one can work against that.
It's an interesting question, and I think the thing that I appreciate in what Eric's describing, and I think is just, you know, and I was trying to describe in part in my own section as well, is I think it's really the notion that the tools themselves will do this work, I think, is the mistake. It's the structure around which the people engage with these tools, which is an incredibly difficult design process, and it's a social design process, and it's time-based. It involves how people frame, the framing in which somebody encounters something, the context in which that room is set up. There's just all of this complexity, and these are questions that architects and designers actually do a lot of quality thinking about, but haven't necessarily thought that it's their purview or it's a context in which architects and designers can think about when it doesn't have to do immediately with the end result of making a new building or reforming a physical space.
But what's often the problem in those kinds of meetings that I've been involved in over the years is what's not on the table. And there are things on the table that aren't in the control of the architects or planners, which had to do with real estate values and all sorts of things that predetermine, you know, whether you're going to get a short building or a high building. So that's also power relationships are what are, in my view, what's often not modeled enough in these scenario game playing things around the city, because there's the question of what's negotiable and who wins and who loses, even if it is a game, right? And so we're going
to extend directly onto that.
Yeah.
My question, which is, and this is a question to all of you, I wonder to what degree are people who are interested or working on either data visualization or, let's say, engagement platforms, overly interested in fairness as an idea? Because that is the sort of trope of this election, which seems kind of equally, if not more, naive and false than the Main Street thing. Because when I interact in practice with, you know, either people at the so-called top, you know, the mayors, the developers, the aldermen, whoever, they're mostly just concerned, they're more concerned with winning than anything else. And when you interact with people at the bottom, so-called bottom, they're mostly just concerned, at the very least, with not losing. But no one at either end, except for us somewhere in the middle, seems particularly naive enough to assume that the game is like fair, right? And so I wonder, like, to what degree you consider that in the work that you do, or you see it as a potential challenge or problem?
Are you asking whether the goal is leveling is often leveling the playing field by revealing, you know, inequity?
Well, I'm asking them, right?
Yeah, no, I mean the panel.
Yeah, well, I mean, I often start in dangerous places, right, with data and subject matter that have been
submerged.
Yeah, taboo.
Taboo. Yeah.
Right, and then try to use that same data to reclaim what's hidden, you know, what's hidden underneath it. And I don't think making it visible is really the goal, although lots of people would say that about what I do, making the invisible visible. But I think there is a field of visibility, and it depends where you are on that field, whether you're an expert in it or not, right? So I think that's what's so smart about what you're saying about your the engagement versus feedback, is that you're bringing together at these meetings a level of expertise from everybody who's there, and it's trying to draw out that expertise, which I think makes it work. So it's not that we're trying to solve intractable problems of society and level the play. I don't feel like any of my work is aiming at that, but it's at least addressing to first ask the right questions, and then from there maybe going forward in different ways. Yeah.
Here and then there.
I think just following up on that, the key issue is what are the rules of the game, and depending on who's telling the story, with data. That's how they tell the stories. That's how
Yeah,
Robert
often.
Moses,
Yeah.
it was okay. What matters is flow rates of people through this corridor. this
Cancer in
artery.
the city, yeah.
What Jane Jacobs did was access other data, and so I want to focus on these two.
She didn't actually. She told us
Yeah.
a more compelling story.
Yeah, yeah.
She told the story. She didn't quantify it.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
It's interesting how much data there is in her book. I read
Very
it
little.
for the first time. Yeah.
That's the thing. When Tufte said, well, we don't, I don't, this is not about the designer, I think he meant capital D. I think obviously.
Yeah.
That obviously design small d, just, the fact that that data that is just left on its own does not tell a story.
Yeah.
Stories emerge out of data,
Right.
and design is one way to bring it forward. And I think similarly, the structures of game scenarios are capable of doing the same thing in a much richer, much more open-ended, much more accessible way. So I'm fearful of the comments that this is ideological. I'm fearful that that will kind of say, well, you can't do data visualization. I think we need to say, be clear, it's ideological, you have to do data
That's right. Well, that's that is
Yeah.
definitely the point.
Just
Yeah,
wanna
yeah.
make
I
sure.
was
Yeah,
yes,
she
100%.
said that,
Yeah,
working
yeah,
through
yeah.
the data.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
What's interesting about and as you say, the whole thing is a game, right? And people, the process of community meetings and design and politics, it's all a game. What's interesting about building a game around that is that people actually start thinking about the rules of the game, because they don't think about the rules of the game normally. They just take them for granted.
Yeah.
And that's what the concept of systems thinking that games can provide is you get people thinking about systems in ways that they don't otherwise.
All of a sudden, you see the magic circle.
That's right.
That we are all in.
That's right.
You
And
can't imagine
Or not in, depending on the construction of the circle.
But that's what's so interesting about in a game, you have to simplify in order to make it an engaging game. But what's intriguing about that is that people will go along with that because they know it's a game, and then they'll actually talk about those rules. I mean, think about how much we talk about the rules of baseball. Like we contend with the rules. We don't just we don't just accept them. We strategize, we question all of those things.
We don't play baseball. We strategize. No, the professionals play the game. We just watch it on TV and from the stands. We're observers of it.
Yeah, so there's a whole other context of professional sports, and maybe I shouldn't have used that as an example, but I guess I was talking about, we talk about it, it becomes part of a story and part of a narrative, but then when we play it, we also sort of deal with those rules. But maybe that wasn't the best example.
I had a couple observations, maybe that more towards pushing wherever this goes forward. One is, something that was brought up earlier this morning, is to examine the context of the problems that you all three pose in relation to things like the Berkeley movement and how technology was actually used as a game-playing mechanism that an acquaintance of mine from New Haven, who was part of the first PhD program, said, that Joe Davis referred to also this morning, that they sat around processing data for several weeks only to just knock a hole in the wall and walk away. So at the end of the day, nothing really came of that project. So it would be interesting to look at its problems relative to planning in the community group. My second observation is, I think an unspoken one that we all assume several ideas about what cities and public spaces or publics really are. You referred to Latour as referring probably to Dewey's argument that the public only emerges when things are contested. There is no public, nor would one say that there, I think Richard, you're alluding to, there's anything that's so much a public space. And I actually didn't think about it. I think modernism doesn't have a public space because it wouldn't exist because there'd be no conflict. So there'd be no need for
Well,
that.
it's the clashing of multiple
Within a paradigm,
subjectivities, yeah.
Which fits the idea of a smoothly running, efficient, everybody gets what they want system.
Yeah.
So I think those things would be interesting things to move forward with on this, because I think your initial question is, we have all this data, but what's it really getting us?
Yeah.
Other than more voices at the table, expressing their personal desires or inputs into the process, but still, I even detected a little in Jesse, your film, there's a kind of, the more that goes on, the more it has less impact. And so there was an idea in Vertov about the city that I think is inherent to the more avant-garde and interesting aspects of modernism, is that the city was the place of estrangement. It It wasn't that art had to do it, it was already there and had to be just captured. And that estrangement was a radical project in 1910, especially in the Soviet Union. Do we still want a radical project, or do we want a more sameness?
Or are people estranged by it because it's no longer new?
I think a lot of community groups would prefer not to have it, and I think it's the design community, which I would include myself in, would want that estrangement. And there's essential, I think, differences in how we perceive what our desires are from different ends of how discourse develops, which is both us and our audiences that we produce for this thing.
So if we just take a few more minutes, I want to come back to something that I think is also at play, and I tried to say it at the beginning of my comments, which has to do with the scalability of data or information, and this idea of the local, the regional, the global. And I think all of us find very compelling, whether it's objective or not, the ability to have as part of the national discourse, this map that Tufte will show where the stimulus money goes, or the other map which was in circulation showing the relationship between voting and Republican and Democratic voting versus the investments and distribution of taxes, right? Which are counterintuitive because the places where people are most against public investment are often getting the most amount of. And so the ability to actually put that out there and to put that in public circulation, we know can change consciousness. I think the challenge for us is, and I think the interest is, how do you go from the national or global or regional scale and relate that, that the flow of capital, the flow of investment, the models of governance down to the way in which a locality is made? Because I think, in the Jacobs-like discourse that displaced a lot of data-driven discussion about the city, we had this idea of the city of neighborhoods, the kind of localization of interests, and there was a loss of ability to actually see the larger forces.
Right.
And this is something I think.
What's interesting to me, and I often discuss this with my students, is that the things I was trained to hate when I was at school. So Jane Jacobs, Kevin Lynch, Chris Alexander, all of those things. They've all been adopted by the locative media and computer world,
and people with progressive politics.
And but in a very new way. And so when you do read Jane Jacobs and you read the last chapter of the book, and you read the way that she describes slums, right? She actually does use a lot of data in her book. It's really interesting when you reread it. You should really read. I really recommend reading it. It's a really fast read. And Kevin Lynch.
His data was pretty weak.
His data was pretty weak, and it was always because he was
but
he was trying to do a whole city, a whole city. And so I just recently had somebody come and do a lecture on cognitive maps in my seminar, and he was doing tiny little neighborhoods, like the difference between a little Korea and little Mexico in LA, and those cognitive maps of where the border is drawn, and it was
mental maps,
they were people's, and it was a different kind of way of making data. So when you say people can put their data onto a Google map, they are making data, and so when people say, oh, there's millions, so much data, like 75% of it are our baby pictures, and nobody talks about it, and
So I mean, but Lynch, for example.
What do I conclude? I do think that there's things to relearn from Kevin Lynch and Jane Jacobs that were totally trained out of us, and that the local, what's local is actually not so easy to define at a scalar in a scalar way, because it is connected to a global scale. So I'm not proposing systems thinking, but that scales are conflated. That there's many conflated scales.
Well, just like with the environmental movement, we that sort of may have made a couple of rounds that were kind of crude. We can return to that, and I agree. I've re-examined Lynch, who was, I think, very strong at the local scale, but even in his own work, scaled that up to kind of regional proposals, which had no data or no.
Right.
So this is what I'm asking about, the scalability of the processes as well.
Right.
Do you have any?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things is that it's what I really, really like about Laura's work and like both the remittances and the $1 Million Blocks projects is that it is like the way that I would in part describe it is that it's data that exists in the world, but it's finding that and reframing it, and there's this, as you said, like a really creative process around that interpretation, and like that data set tells a story in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
The data set of of Tufte's lights, like that, it's a boring data set in some sense. It doesn't tell a story. Like that's a give. Like I know that data exists. It's not.
But it could be correlated with something else.
Yeah, see, and there's that more analytical side. And I guess what I find really interesting is the ability to, and I think it's another form of creativity that is often undervalued and undereducated, which is how we creatively think about reinterpreting and contextualizing data. And not just how do we visualize it, how do we analyze it to make some other correlation exist that we didn't maybe know about, but actually just fundamentally, how do we find data sets and construct data sets that are distinct that then allow us to create projects and have insights that we didn't think we would have access to previously. I think it's a really different problem.
I would advocate maybe as an architect in a city planner, that is always, I think, essentially been the role that the architectural plan has done. It's never realized, but it takes a certain level of data, let's call it as an abstract term, and sets it out as a visual provocation to the public in order to make a public a good reaction.
It is a correlation or a set of correlations.
But it's not that far from it. I mean, having sat in meetings with little cutouts and having people move stuff around, that gets you so far because it has a typology within design. As the games appear to me too, there's not even in the water thing, not as radical as say Super Studios gestures to do the same and completely reverse the problem, change the entire discourse of what the provocation really is about the city.
It's interesting that the conversation has been about good data, because it's not always the case that good data leads to the most compelling stories, and it's just maybe sometimes just the opposite.
Good cities.
Well, sure, but I think that if you think about like the Occupy movement, I mean, what's interesting about that is that in some cases the message was unclear, the data being used was unclear, but the story was compelling regardless of the lack of clarity. And I think that we see that in a lot of things. I mean, if we have an interesting visualization, for instance, regardless of its accuracy, that's probably going to be the raw material for more stories in some cases than something that's really accurate and dry. Right. And not to suggest that good visualizations aren't accurate, but I just want to sort of point that out, that there's a qualitative measure to this, and it goes to Jesse's work, and it's the sort of aesthetic qualities.
Well, the way ideas are internalized by various audiences has a correlate, is important to the way in which they are owned or engaged.
Right, but also the way that there's the potential to write a software that enables people to work in this way, which is much more open-ended and creates an archive and all the things that it is gone, but those things weren't possible with those huge computers in rooms, and people were experimenting. They weren't doing the kinds of things that both Jesse and Eric are doing. Gapminder, yeah.
The database is just out there.
Yeah.
But it's I think that we should conclude. But I think what's interesting is it's the aspect to which this is a social project as much as a technological one that you're all emphasizing.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.